Hi, everyone. My name is Ala Marchinga. I'm a president and executive co-director of the AURORA Philosophy Institute. And it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for this evening, Ronen Grunberg, who will indeed talk about the concept of pleasure in philosophy. Ronen originally created the idea of the Tuesday Philosophy Club more than 15 years ago, and many of us at the API were inspired about philosophy by listening to Ronen. He is now a vice president technology of the API. Welcome, Ronen.
Thank you very much. I'm glad. No, it's a pleasure to be here.
Likewise.
Okay, so I guess I can begin. And in order for me to do that, I'm going to have to share the screen. So let me just share the screen. So originally, this presentation was going to be Epicurean pleasure. And I decided that I would broaden it up a bit and talk about pleasure in a more broader sense. So the philosophy of pleasure as opposed to just Epicurean pleasure. And that's what I'm going to be doing. Now, if you think about pleasure, of all the philosophical ideas, almost everybody thinks that they understand what pleasure is because it's something that we all experience. It's very visceral. It's very much a sensory experience. So we think we know what it is. Pleasure is good sensation, it's happiness, it's joy, it's positivity, it's a lot of things. Ultimately, we think of pleasure as a good. It's a good thing. And a lot of people work towards maximizing their pleasure and minimizing pain because pain is not a good thing. So we work for pleasure. So philosophically speaking, the pleasure principle is a thing that makes experience appealing and attractive. So if pleasure is attractive, then the opposite of pleasure, pain, is unattractive, and it's something that we try to avoid. So in the philosophy of pleasure, all philosophers who talk about pleasure generally think of it as an essential thing. It is fundamental. It is really the fulcrum around which human life, and not just human life, life of sentient animals in general, live around. You know, we all seek pleasure. And it's essential. It's essential to a good life. It motivates our existence. So we work towards maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain. But here's the problem. You know, if you think about the ontology of pleasure, and if you think about, you know, what constitutes pleasure and what constitutes pain, sometimes it's not that easy to differentiate between pleasure and pain. You know, even though the question of what is pleasure and what is pain seems really easy, it's actually, you know, not that easy to sometimes give a clear answer as to what constitutes pain and what constitutes pleasure. It's nuanced. It can be very subtle. And I'm sure you all probably recognize the fact that there is a gradation between pleasure and pain. Something pleasurable, if it becomes extreme, can become painful, and vice versa. So it's not like there's pain and there's pleasure. There are shades of gray. So in this presentation, I'm going to discuss the following things. I'm going to discuss pleasure as a sensation. So pleasure is a simple concept. I'm going to discuss motivational hedonism, which is also known as egoistic hedonism, or it's like a class of egoistic hedonism. I'm going to be discussing a little bit about how Plato thinks of pleasure, and then Aristotle, and then Epicurus, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about Stoicism, and then Freud, and then finally the hedonic paradox. So I'm covering a lot tonight. I'm doing it very quickly. I'm not going to, really focus on a lot of detail on any of these topics, and I'm going to go as quickly as possible because I only have about an hour, 45 minutes to an hour. And I told John I'm not going to spend too much time talking, but then I got into doing this presentation and it just seemed like I had a lot to discuss and I probably have more than I need. So I'm going to try to, go as quickly as I can. Okay, so a lot of people think of pleasure as a sensation. It's a sensation that's experienced by the body. And we either think of pleasure as localized or diffused. It's a localized or diffused bodily sensation. But pleasurable sensation is not absolute, which means that it's dependent on context. If the context changes, if your mood changes, if your temperament is such and such versus another type of temperament, then you're going to feel pleasure and pain very, very differently. So in other words, what might be perceived as pleasure in one context may be perceived as not pleasurable in another context. So this suggests that there's a distinction between sensation and hedonic response, the pleasurable response. So sensation is not necessarily what constitutes the hedonic or pleasurable response. Hedonism, by the way, is just a word that means pleasure. And the hedonic response is not necessarily based on what you experience only. It's what you experience, possibly, as well as a cognitively comprehended or apprehended component. So maybe pleasure is about experience, but it's also about what our cognition tells us. It's also what we think. And this is a very important idea that was promoted by Gilbert Ryle. Gilbert Ryle was not the only person who promoted this idea, but he was one of the philosophers, a linguistic philosopher, who promoted this idea that pleasure is a significant part of cognition. And it's not just a simple bodily sensation akin to pain. In fact, Gilbert Ryle said that pleasure is a mode of engagement. It's a mode of engagement. In other words, pleasure comes from our everyday pursuits in the world. What we do is what gives us pleasure. So it's not the thing itself that we're seeking. Pleasure is not the thing itself that we're seeking. We're going through the world doing our thing, and pleasure is a kind of byproduct. And it's not just sensation. It's not mere sensation. There is a significant cognitive intention that's a part of pleasure. And this brings up an important question. Is pleasure fundamentally a feeling, something that we isolate experientially, or is it an attitude toward a sensation or activity? Does pleasure lie in the sensation or experience itself, or in our attitude towards the experience? And this is a really important question because it is at the heart of all hedonic philosophical discussions. Now, Gilbert Ryle takes it one step further. He not only says that it's cognitively significant or it's related to our cognition, but he also says that it's related to our disposition. In other words, our personality. We get pleasure by what we are disposed to do, based on whom we are. This pleasure happens when whatever we are disposed to do is interrupted or interfered with. If something gets in the way of our disposition, then we experience displeasure. So a very important idea, and this is something that's going to come up later as well, is the fact that for Gilbert Ryle, pleasure is inside out. It's not outside in. The way we relate to pleasure cognitively is more important than the sensation that comes from the outside. And our disposition is fundamental. So, motivational hedonism. Gilbert Ryle represents a type of motivational hedonist, or at least what he says represents a type of motivational hedonism. And motivational hedonism is also sometimes called psychological hedonism. And basically it says that our desires, our psychological motivations, our desires propel us to seek pleasure and avoid pain. And fundamentally, it's what guides 100% of our behavior. At least that's what the strong motivational hedonists say. There is a weak variation of the theory that essentially says that it's what guides a lot of our behavior. It doesn't guide all of our behavior, it guides a lot of our behavior. Some philosophers say that the weak version doesn't amount to much because it's like stating a tautology. It's a truism to say that pleasure motivates some of our behavior, but it's significant to say that pleasure motivates all of our behavior, because I think some people would disagree with that strongly. Now, one important thing that motivational hedonists argue is that a lot of our disposition towards pleasure, or our seeking pleasure, is unconsciously motivated. It's not only consciously motivated, it's unconsciously motivated. As we will see when we talk about Freud, when I get to Freud, for Freud, pleasure is not a conscious motivation, it's an unconscious motivation. The motivational hedonists really focus on the unconscious part, and they're very interested in unconscious desires. And some of the philosophers that kind of argued motivational hedonism include people like Epicurus, of course, Sigmund Freud with his id, ego, superego, Jeremy Bentham with utilitarianism, John Stuart Mill, also utilitarian, Plato with his concept of the good. They all argue a form of motivational hedonism. And of course, not to forget Aristotle, who's kind of a follower of Plato or a student of Plato. He also argues kind of a similar idea. So let's begin with one of my favorite philosophers. As everybody in the philosophy club knows, I always get back to Plato. And Plato, of course, is not typically thought of as a hedonist. He certainly wouldn't call himself a hedonist. However, Plato, like all philosophers, is very interested in answering the question and dealing with the question of what constitutes pleasure and how pleasure is related to the good. How is pleasure related to a good life? And for Plato, pleasure is intimately related to a person's intentions, similar to what Gilbert Ryle says. Unlike a hardcore hedonist who argues that the pursuit of pleasure motivates everything that we do, Plato takes the view that the pursuit of pleasure wisely can lead to the best possible life. He doesn't argue that pleasure motivates everything that we do, but he recognizes that pleasure motivates a lot of what we do, but he also says that pleasure must be sought wisely, because it's only then that we will lead a good life. And the pursuit of pleasure without wisdom can, and often does, lead us astray, and ironically causes more pain. So when we pursue pleasure unwisely, it can actually make us hurt, and hurt really bad. But this brings up the question of, what does it mean to pursue pleasure wisely? There's an interesting quotation from Plato's credo that highlights what Plato might be thinking. He says, "The first and greatest victory is to conquer yourself. To be conquered by yourself is of all things most shameful and vile." So this quotation suggests something very interesting about what Plato thinks regarding human motivation. To act on impulse or in the blind pursuit of pleasure is shameful. And it is shameful because it distracts us from what really matters. The blind pursuit of pleasure is a distraction from what really matters. And what really matters are the things, pursuing things that have the potential to make us better human beings. And to have pleasure and the avoidance of pain as the only goal in life makes us no better than brute animals, ordinary animals. So he does not believe in hardcore hedonism. Now, a lot of what Plato had to say about pleasure and pain can be found in the dialogue Protagoras, of a very famous dialogue written by Plato, and one of the main characters in there is Socrates. And the main discussion about pleasure is between Protagoras and Socrates. Now, Protagoras was a well-known sophist philosopher. I won't get into what the sophist philosopher said, but I'm sure a lot of you already know. In any event, at one point, the discussion turns to the question of what constitutes pleasure, the discussion between Socrates and Protagoras. And Socrates points out that it's not uncommon for people to hurt themselves in the pursuit of pleasure. It's not uncommon for people to fail to see that what we call bad is not necessarily unpleasant in the short term. Bad things can be pleasurable. However, they are only pleasurable in the short term. For example, people will overindulge in eating food that causes pleasurable sensations, but harm the body in the long run. We're all familiar with that. We go to the restaurant, we're enjoying the food, it's pleasurable, we're eating away, and then we come home and we feel sick because we've overindulged. It was pleasurable, but the end result is not pleasurable. And what Socrates says is that this is not only true of like immediate pleasures like I just described, but even pleasures that have long-term repercussions. And so the question is, why would people do this? Why would somebody indulge themselves in short-term pleasure when what they're going to get is long-term pain? Plato or Socrates in this dialogue says it's because they do not know that pleasure is short while pain is long. They don't have an awareness of this. It's really a matter of ignorance. People are ignorant, and people make mistakes because they are ignorant. They don't see the long-term consequences because they tend to focus on the short-term pleasures. He gives the example of someone mistaking the sizes of things because of not taking into account distances. They think that something is small, when in fact it's not small at all. It's just far away, so it looks small. So what's Socrates' solution to this? He says, in order not to make such a mistake, one has to have knowledge and the ability to use reason. Socrates' assumption is that being wise and reasonable will prevent self-harm. It will prevent people from overindulging in vacuous and harmful pleasures. And to be overcome by pleasure is really equivalent to being ignorant. So pleasure is always something to be sought in the light of knowledge and for a good purpose. Now, Socrates does not completely reject the pursuit of pleasure. And this is another very important point. He says the pursuit of pleasure has to be toward a higher end, a higher goal, specifically the form of the good. In a nutshell, Plato believes that indulging ourselves only in the stuff of the material world in the pursuit of bodily pleasure is missing something extremely important. And he makes the point that sometimes, we're experiencing pleasure even though we don't have a bodily need for pleasure. So one of the things that hedonists argue is that the reason we seek pleasure is because we have a bodily need for it. Our body needs it. To give a simple example, we're hungry. Our body needs food. In order to survive, we eat food, we experience pleasure. But Plato and Socrates says, well, sometimes we actually have pleasure when we have no real bodily need. And he asks the question, well, what does that mean? And he says, well, this suggests that in a way, pleasure transcends the body. It transcends the body and suggests that there is a part of us that is motivated by something beyond the body. Now, here are some things that we do that are not related to the body that give us pleasure. For example, having a conversation, learning something new, having a thought, an interesting thought, having an insight, gaining knowledge, experiencing love, friendship, seeking the truth. These are all pleasurable things, but they're pleasurable things that don't in any way satiate the body. They're not sensations in the body. All of these things point us toward something, and what Socrates says they point us toward is the form of the good, which transcends the materiality of the body. So at this point, I'm just going to bring up a very important Platonic idea, and that's the concept of recollection. At the heart of Plato is the notion of anamnesis. Anamnesis just means recollection. And this is the idea that human beings basically possess innate knowledge, and that our goal in life is to discover or rediscover the knowledge that we have within us. We have innate knowledge, and that knowledge is in us. And our goal is basically to remember that knowledge that we've forgotten. According to Plato, the soul is trapped in the body, and the soul once existed outside of the body, not in this world, says Plato, but in another world, in a transcendent world. It got trapped in the body, and everything that it knew before it forgot. And the goal of recollection is to get back to true knowledge. And to do this, one has to overcome the body. So pleasure, to get back to that, is not about indulging the body, but about overcoming the body and reconnecting with the transcendent reality that we've forgotten. And that reality for Plato is the form of the good. Now, Aristotle, who was a student of Plato, also sees pleasure as a means to an end. It's not an end in itself, it's a means to an end. And it should never really be sought as an end in itself. For Aristotle, pleasure and happiness intertwine. Okay, so another question that often arises in the philosophy of pleasure is, well, what is the difference between happiness and pleasure? Are they the same thing? Well, Aristotle says that happiness and pleasure intertwine. And he says this because of his idea of teleology. At the core of his philosophy is the notion of teleology, or telos. Teleology comes from the Greek word telos. It means end or goal, and is basically the belief that there's a purpose that pervades all reality. All reality has some sort of an end goal, a purpose. And for Aristotle, pleasure and happiness arise when the purpose of a thing is unimpeded. So given that all sentient beings have a purpose, in fact, Aristotle says that all things have a purpose, but human beings particularly have a sentient purpose. They're conscious and aware. They get pleasure. Human beings get pleasure when the purpose of their life, whatever they are constituted to do, is unimpeded. True happiness encompasses the small pleasures of life, but the end goal is a fulfilled life. We have small pleasures along the way. The difference between pleasure and happiness is that happiness is the end goal. Pleasures are the little sort of things that we experience along the way, and happiness is the end goal of a life well lived, fulfilling its purpose, its goal, its end. So happiness is an end in itself for Aristotle. Pleasures are just a means to an end, and the end that they are a means to is happiness. And happiness is the goal that encompasses the totality of one's life. And it's not something that you can gain or lose in a few hours, like a pleasurable sensation. Pleasure is a byproduct of living, moving, doing things. It's a byproduct. And it's a byproduct or an outcome of an unimpeded life that moves from potentiality to actuality. A good life is one that moves unimpeded from potential to actual. And ultimately, the value of life, how we measure it, is by how well we've lived it, how well we've fulfilled the potential that we have as human beings. And pain, the pain that we experience, is what we experience when potential goes unfulfilled. So, for example, regret is a kind of pain. Now, sometimes potential goes unfulfilled, not because of the fault of the person, but because of circumstances beyond their control. They may have a psychological illness. They may have a physical disability of some sort that makes it very difficult for them to fulfill their potential. However, Aristotle says that no matter what stands in our way, the truth of a well-lived life is doing whatever you can to fulfill your potential and to overcome external circumstances or internal circumstances. So in essence, the goal for Aristotle is to avoid pain and move unimpeded towards one's purpose. Okay, let's move on to Epicurean pleasure. Everybody knows or has heard about Epicurean pleasure. Epicurus advocated something actually very similar to what Plato and Aristotle advocated. He says that one has to live life moderately in order to avoid suffering incurred by overindulgence and too much pleasure. He says that trying to get pleasure is an innate part of human existence, but we need to be careful because we can't overindulge ourselves. And it's not inconceivable that, you know, we can make judgments, error in judgments when we seek pleasure, believing that, you know, certain things will lead to pleasure when in fact they will lead to pain. Now, Epicureanism divides pleasure into two broad categories: pleasure of the body and pleasure of the mind. Pleasure of the body involves sensations of the body. Pleasures of the mind basically are sensations of the mind, mental processes and states, feelings of joy, the lack of fear, pleasant memories. Pleasures of the mind don't exist only in the present. They exist in the past and in the future, but the pleasures of the body exist only in the present. The pleasures of the body can only be experienced in the moment. The pleasures of the mind are much more important for Epicurus because they exist in the past, the present, and in the future. The greatest pleasure a person can reach is the complete removal of pain. That's an important idea in Epicureanism. If you can remove pain, if you can avoid pain completely, you basically have reached or you have a good life. And in order to do that, in order to control pain, a person has to learn to control his or her desires, because desire itself is seen as painful. If you want something really badly and you can't get it, that desire is a pain. Epicurean philosophy distinguishes three types of desire: natural and necessary desire, natural but not necessary desire, not natural and not necessary. Now, I'm not going to read all of these because I do have a lot more to go through and I want to have a lot of time to talk. But in essence, natural and necessary desire are things that we absolutely need to live. We absolutely need those things to live. Natural and not necessary are things that we may need to live, but there is an aspect of those things that we don't really need. So for example, natural and necessary is food. Natural but not necessary is really good tasting food. You know, you need food to survive, but you don't need tasty food. And then there are natural and not necessary desires. And then those would be things like wealth, fame, things that are superfluous, that aren't going to really give us anything in the long run. And in fact, wanting them may give us more pain than pleasure. So for Epicurus, one should always follow natural and necessary desires and avoid natural and unnecessary, and definitely avoid the unnecessary desires. One of his followers basically said, you know, about Epicureanism, that it's a philosophy that advocates don't fear God, don't worry about death, and what is good is easy to get because it's very basic. Okay, the Stoics are often put side by side with the Epicureans. I'm going to go very quickly through the Stoic philosophy. Stoics basically argue that pleasure is necessary, just like the Epicureans do. However, they also argue that it's impossible to avoid pain. So the Epicureans argue that we should avoid pain at all costs. But the Stoics say, no, we should not avoid pain because we can't avoid pain. So while they agree quite a bit with what the Epicureans have to say, they reject the idea that it's possible to avoid pain. Instead, they believe that one should accept the inevitability of pain and learn how to deal with it without letting it get in the way of achieving happiness. Seneca basically argued this, and I have a very long quotation, which I'm not going to read because it's too long. I'm just going to go on. But basically, what Seneca says is that we have to learn to lead a good life. We have to learn how to deal with our pains. And so while we don't want to experience pain, if we do experience pain, we need to learn how to live with it and still have a good life and still enjoy life. So we don't want to lose a limb, but if we lose a limb, we lose a limb. That's life. And we go on and we bear it and we're stoic about it. Because there are lots of things that are outside of our control, and therefore there are many things that can and will befall us that will make our life difficult. It's unequivocal. Everybody is going to have a difficult time at some point in their life. They'll experience sickness, loss, poverty, death, and other tragedies that befall human beings, and we don't have any control over these things. And it's all a matter of fortune in the end, right? The goddess Fortuna, the Roman goddess of fortune or luck, will decide what will become of us, and what we have to learn to do is accept things with strength and with fortitude, because we have no choice. And that, in fact, the Stoics argue, not only do we not have any choice, we should be open to it. We should be open to misfortune and learn to laugh at misfortune. So if fortune gives you bad luck, laugh at it. And if you laugh at it, it's going to make your life better, and you're going to be happier, and you're going to even experience a certain amount of pleasure in laughing at misfortune. So courage and wisdom is fundamental to living a good life for the Stoics. One of the most important things too for the Stoics is don't act on impulse. Don't give in to your base desires. Try to avoid those. In fact, all the hedonists argue, or most of the hedonists argue, don't give in to your base desires for pleasure, because they may give you more pain than pleasure. Okay, the final person I'm going to deal with is Freud. And I think what I'll do is, after I talk about Freud, is just open the floor to conversation. And I'll let you talk about the things that I've discussed here. So Freud is not really a philosopher. I mean, he's a psychoanalyst, but many of the ideas that he promotes are philosophical in nature. And one of his central ideas is the pleasure principle. And like all hedonic philosophies, Freud develops a philosophy that argues the principle of maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain. And he does this through his tripartite division of the mind, which is, he says, made up of the id, the ego, and the superego. The pleasure principle is the id part of the mind, and it's the driving force of life and seeks immediate gratification. So when we're born as infants, we're essentially id. says Freud. So when we're born and all we want is to have our physical needs gratified, what we're living is essentially a simple hedonic life. It would constitute what Freud would call simple hedonism, where the goal is to maximize pleasure and sensation, maximize sensation, the needs of the body. The id strives to fulfill our most basic and primitive urges: hunger, thirst, sex. When we're adults, we are still driven by these motivations, but they can't be expressed fully because it's not acceptable. Immediate gratification is not something that is acceptable when we live our life as adults. When we live our life as children, yes, it's okay for the id to control our life. You know, if a child is hungry, it's going to cry and it's going to stomp up and down and it's going to do what it needs to do to get what it needs to survive. And children, says Freud, act on their urges, and it's perfectly normal. Children will try to satisfy the urges without giving thought to whether or not the behavior is considered acceptable. Children don't think that way. They'll do whatever they can to satisfy the urges, no matter what. And it's cute. I mean, as adults, we think children are cute when they do this. But if an adult does this, it's considered pathological. It's the beginning of what constitutes sociopathology, being a sociopath, if you can't control your urges. So Freud says that in order to function in society, the id must be mitigated, it must be controlled. And the part of ourselves that controls the id is the ego. The ego is our conscious mind. It's the part of ourselves that makes conscious decisions. People are generally unaware of anything except their ego. They're not aware of their id. They're not consciously aware of their id. They're only aware of their ego, their rational part of the mind. So when the id actually does propel us into doing something, we're not aware that it's the id doing it, right? We may rationalize whatever we're doing through the ego, through our rational mind, even though it's actually something that the id is propelling us into doing. We're not always aware of it. But the id, says Freud, will often break through and will have us maximize our unconscious desires. Now, one of the things that Freud says is that pleasure is the domain of the id. However, pleasure, absolute pleasure, is impossible. Egoistic hedonism is an impossibility. When human beings are propelled through life this way, they manifest psychological pathology and they can't live well. They suffer. So an interesting thing, I'm just going to mention this very quickly. An interesting thing that Freud points out is that there's a relationship between the id, or the pleasure impulse, the pleasure principle, and jokes. He argues that jokes are pleasurable and funny. We find them funny and pleasurable because they enable the id to express itself in a socially acceptable manner. In other words, jokes allow us to express many of our deepest sexual, aggressive, and cynical thoughts and feelings, which would otherwise remain repressed. And what makes them funny is the element of surprise. You know, the reason a joke is funny is because it surprises us. And what surprises us is the fact that something within us is brought to the surface. Something from our inner id is brought to the surface. It's something unconscious in us. And we become aware for a moment of something in ourselves that was repressed. And the laughter comes from the discomfort that we feel in becoming aware of something in us that we didn't have a conscious awareness actually existed. That's basically Freud's theory of where jokes come from, or what makes jokes funny. The final part of the tripartite is the superego, and the superego is thought of as the inner psychological police officer. It's that part of the mind that lets the ego know what is allowed and what is not allowed. Because we think of ourselves as autonomous and free agents, we externalize both the id and the superego. We don't think of them as being in us. We think of them as being outside of us. And one way to think of the id and the superego is the devil, and the devil externalized is the embodiment of the id, and the superego externalized is the embodiment of God. So the human mind is in a constant battle between the id and the superego. And we think that we act on our own free will, but in fact, our decisions and actions are determined and are actually the winning side of the battle. Either the id will win or the superego will win, one or the other, and whatever side wins is how we will behave. So in terms of hedonic pleasure, Freud argues that it is impossible. Hedonic pleasure is impossible because of social and personal constraints. It's impossible to experience all the pleasure that we desire. However, the problem is that we still desire it. It doesn't go away. So the way that Freud deals with it is with the concept of sublimation. He says we sublimate our desire for pleasure. Sublimation is just the idea of changing something. Sublimation is the diversion of energy from one thing into another thing. It's a purification of our impulses. It's the ennoblement of our impulses. So sublimation is a mature type of defense mechanism in which socially unacceptable impulses or ideas are transformed into socially acceptable actions or behavior, resulting in long-term conversion of the initial impulse. So the initial impulse is made into something that is acceptable. So for example, if a person has an impulse to do something like kill, he might write a murder mystery instead. He will sublimate his impulse into something creative. So pleasure and happiness cannot be experienced directly, according to Freud, but must be experienced in an indirect and socially acceptable way. The problem is that very few people can do this. Very few people can effectively sublimate their impulses. And this means, says Freud, that unhappiness and displeasure is an inevitable reality for all human beings, or for most human beings. Here's Freud's very famous quotation on this. He says, "I do not doubt that it would be easier for fate to take away your suffering than it would for me. But you will see for yourself that much has been gained if we succeed in turning your hysterical misery into common unhappiness. With a mental life that has been restored to health, you will be better armed against that unhappiness." Basically, he says, we're all unhappy. and we're going to be unhappy. But it's good to be unhappy with a healthy mind, because then you can deal with it.